Well, I want to welcome everyone to the channel today. We have a very special guest with us. But before I get into that, I just want to repeat that I am on sabbatical this month. Really excited to be able to step away. It has been a lot in the last year. I started this channel maybe about a year ago, and I have just really needed a period of rest and a change of pace as well. And my hope is that you enjoy the channel, the content. I can tell you guys, I may be at 1,000 views by now. I'm not really sure by the time this records, but I'm really close now. You guys have liked, you subscribed, and if you haven't subscribed, please hit the subscription button there. But you guys have done such an amazing job just consuming the content, and I am humbled, so humbled for so many of you that have been loyal and faithful and find what this is helpful. And I just want to continue to have it be helpful to you. So please subscribe. I thank you for that. And let's get into our guest today. This month, again, we are going to really focus on Sabbath. What's the theology? What's the discipline? What is the practice of Sabbath as I am on a Sabbath? But what is that? And how can we trust what God says and our interpretation of that? So I've got Jason Alexander. Jason and his wife, Justine, and their daughter, Hannah, live in Puyallup, Wisconsin. Sorry, at
Yeah,
Washington.
that's close, dude. You're almost
Washington,
there.
where he serves as a pastor for the South Sound Church of Christ. Jason attended the University of Wisconsin, where he studied Hebrew and Semitic studies. He was appointed as a kingdom teacher in 2014. He is just literally one of just a handful of folks that I've called in the last 2 to 3 years when I've really had really tough, complex questions. And he is someone who knows Old Testament theology. He knows the Hebrew. He knows Aramaic. We can give him some very, very tough questions, and I intend to today. Jason, welcome to the channel, brother.
Wow, dude, that is I'm not sure any of that's true, but that's amazing. Thank you. That's great,
All
dude.
true.
Listen, so it's Puyallup. My wife in public called it Puyallup. So we're still trying to pronounce things right. So that was a great stab at it, man. Well done.
Bless you, brother. Thanks for coming on today. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
it's a delight for sure.
Going back a couple years ago, I remember I reached out to you. I think it had to do with Hebrew. I think it was maybe around my first, maybe second semester studying Hebrew.
Oh yeah,
And
okay.
then I found you. I think I was reading the Shema. And
Yes.
and I was calling you because I was like, okay, I'm thinking about reading it. Should I say Adonai or Yahweh or Yahweh or
Oh,
Yah?
right. Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah, man,
remember
you
that.
broke it down
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah. Word up. I remember that. Yeah. Yeah, and you are the only human being to ever make me feel like a little boy. I'm 6'5", dude. So like I come across someone taller than me like rare occasion, but you win, dude. You're living the dream. You got the spiritual gift.
That's humbling, bro. I don't most of our listeners don't know that I'm 6'10".
Dude,
They just see me on this screen and
it's
then in
rare.
person. I remember Steve Kennard at the teachers conference was like, I mean, he just couldn't
Yeah,
wrap his head.
it's staggering, man. Like I said, dude, I'm a big dude. Like
you are a big dude.
I'm taller than everyone I know. So well done. Yeah,
You're a
that's
big
good.
dude. Well, tell us a little bit about your conversion and why you went into the ministry, brother.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm from Rockford, Illinois, and it's you know, I suppose it's a common thing in our world, but you know, born of a certain amount of dysfunction, you know, divorce and separation and moving, and so I've moved around a bit between Illinois and Wisconsin, but so I have a lot of family still in Rockford, but I spent like the formative period of my life in Wisconsin. And around high school, we moved to what was then my grandfather's fishing cottage, like on Lake Wisconsin, just as a like, you know, not sure where we're going to move next. We landed there, but it ended up being like 10 years. So I went to high school in this little town north of Madison, Wisconsin. And there I swam and fished and ran through the woods until that got boring. And then, yeah, as a kid, now I have a ton of, I mean, it's been formational for me in my my thinking about God. It's just a beautiful place. But at the time, it was kind of dull. So I threw myself into hip hop culture, which was like the oddest fit ever, like small town Wisconsin. And, so it was a bit of an identity crisis there happening. But I had been introduced to the thought of God pretty young. And I went to what do you call it? It was a Lutheran school, like kindergarten through second grade. And so I think that season of my life was, that was difficult. It did some things to me that probably weren't positive, that environment, but it really set a basis for me for thinking about God and church. And so I kind of lived almost haunted by the thought of God, like all the way through high school in those kind of confusing years in Lodi, Wisconsin. Around 1998, I had just graduated high school. I don't know what it was that moved me toward reading the Bible, because I was like not a reader, like D- student, barely made it through high school.
Yep. Same here.
Is that right? Okay,
Same
good.
Here, brother.
Because I'm not, now I'm trying to wear that as a badge, but I could have done better. But there was, there was a searching in my life at that season. And, again, I'm just throwing myself into trying to be the illest, MC turntablist in Lodi, Wisconsin. And that just wasn't enough, believe it or not. So, but there was a kid that had started reading the Bible. He was like a year older than me. And I heard about it. And someone told me, oh yeah, this dude, he read the book of Revelation, which is, it's a book of the Bible about the end of the world. And I remember being like, there's a book that, about the end of the world, like I got to get involved. So I found the nearest King James Bible and read through Revelation, and there you go.
In the King James, brother.
Oh man, yeah, for sure. You had to. It was like, you got to read in the King James. So that's that's the oldest edition. So yeah, but I picked up the Bible, and it's strange. It's a small town, and it was just like wildfire, man. Like me and my friends, we all just started reading the Bible together. It was kind of odd. And so for about a year, like on our own, this crew of like kids that were really, involved in the hip hop community and like just reading scripture and, trying to sort it out and making a ton of mistakes. And then I was invited to the church, which I later would place membership in Madison, the Madison Church of Christ. And all me and my friends went there. We did like a introductory Bible study with some guys. Felt like I learned more in that moment than I had in the previous year with my ridiculous friends. So yeah, we all just like we were captivated. We all became members of the church together. We were all baptized together. It was pretty exciting. And it's a small town, so word travels fast. D- students, a group of them are all reading the Bible together. So, so it was a pretty special moment, because you really saw God taking hold of, I was a part of a group kind of conversion almost. It's really interesting.
And then you've been in the ministry for how long now?
I guess doing ministry exclusively since about 2014. I worked for while I was in grad school. I did I did like, what do you call it, part-time ministry, I guess, in Madison for a number of years. But yeah, so I guess I'm on like year 7, maybe. So it's time. It's time for my sabbatical too.
That's right. It's
Yeah,
right,
man.
man. It's so needed, man. Hey,
Yeah,
so the theology of Sabbath is misunderstood. It's probably not very well understood.
yeah.
And we've got wow, there's a lot of different reactions to Sabbath. I mean, you have Torah observant Christians, Seventh-day
Right,
Adventists. Um, we I mean, when you look at Judaism as a whole, their understanding of Sabbath, I think, is very different from a westernized
right,
understanding
right.
of Sabbath. Let's just start with a basic theological understanding of Sabbath. Let's start there.
Oh, yeah. Well, um, yeah, I continue to learn about what to do with how this issue presents itself in the Christian Bible, because it isn't necessarily uh, easy to grasp what to do about it. And of course, in a in a very hurried world, I've noticed, at least among churches like the one we're a part of, a renewed interest in rest. um, and I think that's appropriate. I think people are on the verge of burning out in every corner of our world, and it's discouraging when that's the case among the people of God. So there is, I think, a something of a hunger in certain places to make sense of it. Um, yeah, so the Bible doesn't necessarily speak in one direction about the Sabbath. There's at least two rationales for why the Sabbath is important. But of course, the first time one encounters the idea in the Bible is Genesis chapter 2. But the word Sabbath doesn't appear in Genesis chapter 2. It's but a verbal form, and it's not clear whether the noun or the verb came first. But so you don't get like the Sabbath as a regular day of rest as it becomes a little later in the Bible. But in Genesis chapter 1, it merely says that God had rested, or probably an even more helpful way of taking the word, the verb Shabbat, to cease. God stops, ceases his work. And that, how that comes up in Genesis is I think really important to the creation story, at least that first part of the that first creation as it unfolds, because there's this development of a very ordered world emerges out of a non-order, and it does so by like divine fiat, right? It's like this God calling disorder into order. And he's pictured almost like, I'm thinking of Psalms like Psalm 33, where there's this poetic retelling of God as creator, and it's he breathes stars, but it uses the language there of command, that God commands things to be, and that's very stately, regal language. God portrayed almost as this like ancient Near Eastern royal being, king, calling creation into being. And I think there's certain things that happen, like the issue of the 7 days, which if we were to read on in the Christian Bible, or we were to take in some of the other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, we'd notice that 7 has much to do with deities living in a temple. So long and short, I think what we have going on in the first chapter of the Bible and into the first three verses of the next chapter is a story of God organizing the world and ceasing from his work, or taking up a kind of residence in the created world as a temple. And we'd want to say, well, if Genesis wanted to tell us about a temple, why didn't he just do it? And to which we could say, well, he did.
Right.
He really has taken some pains to portray creation as a place where it's organized by God, but the world is just a house. It's not necessarily a home for God until he ceases and takes up rest. Now you have to move down the story just a little bit. How you doing, by the way? Cut me off if
This is great. No.
okay,
I'm tracking with
what I
you.
end up saying doesn't make sense.
I'm tracking with
Please
you.
stop me, because it might not make sense to me either. But when it comes to the story of the Ten Commandments, the fourth word of the 10 words is to in Exodus, it's remember the Sabbath. And then it points back to the story of God as a creator. He ceases from his work. But what's interesting in Exodus and the 10 Commandments, when it points back to the creation, it says that God on the seventh day, in ceasing from his work, took up his menucha, his rest, his place. This is a word. It comes from the Hebrew verb nuach, but it's used in ways like, for example, Deuteronomy calls the land of Canaan, where Israel will inherit this these new neighborhoods, this whole new geographical safe place. It's called menucha. It's called the land of rest, right? Well, it talks about God on the seventh day of taking up his menucha, entering into his rest. It's also the same word used to describe God's residence in the temple. It's his place of rest. It's his place of repose. And the idea with the temple, I think, again, taking its cues from creation, is that when God comes to take up his rest in the temple, you should see it as kind of like a hub of all creation, from where God rules the cosmos. And there are a number of other interesting things in Genesis 2 that point in that direction, that where God lives, where the deity lives, other ancient Near Eastern creation stories where you notice that where the God is, that's the place from which life and creation flows out, right? Even the story of Eden, it's the same thing. But so if that's the case, if God creating the world and resting, or taking up, in the words of Exodus, his repose, his resting, it's his dwelling place. He's like taking up rest. He's coming to settle in creation. Then we really have to see creation as something belonging to God, that he will run under his great authority and care. I mean, Genesis 1, there's nothing about Genesis 1 that would make us believe that this is a harsh God, right? I mean, it's very compassionate, gracious, people focused, or at least he's concerned about the flourishing of humanity. He comes to take up rest. So that's the thinking, I think, in Genesis 1, is that the Sabbath isn't the word doesn't show up, but God's resting has to do, God's ceasing his work is a way of talking about God coming to settle or take up his rest in creation. It's temple.
When I took my Pentateuch class, and I actually did an interview recently with Joel, and I brought this up, Joel Pete, I did an interview, and I brought this idea up of, let's think about it from the perspective of the ancient Near East.
Right.
And the brothers and sisters, the neighbors that they had. You have in Genesis 1 and 2 a God who is really represented, as you had mentioned, like a divine king, and he orders the chaos.
Yeah.
The cosmos, essentially. He's
chaos to cosmos. Right.
Yes, he has ordered that. He's conquered it. And now we're invited into that. And so Sandra Richter, her perspective is that we're living in Adam's, we're living without God's Sabbath. We're living without his,
Oh, I
essentially
see.
what
Yeah.
we're living in right now is Adam's idea, but Adam doesn't have the power to order the cosmos.
Right.
Adam doesn't have the ability, and that's where we have trauma, right? It's things
Oh,
that kind of
yeah,
get
that's
all out of
great.
whack. And so Adam doesn't, so we're living in Adam's reality, really nightmare.
Right, right.
And so to some degree, I just kind of look at the underpinnings of, we just read over things sometimes. Even when you look at,
My lion. Yep.
just to throw this out briefly, you look at the Genesis 1 and 2, and when you look at comparative ancient Near East religions, take the Numa Elish, which you know
Hmm.
very well, and Tiamat.
Yeah, yeah. When
If
on
you were a
high, right.
Jewish person, you would have thought about this story and you would have compared it to other ancient Near East origin stories, right? There
Yeah.
would have been
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of a
yeah.
comparison between Yahweh and then the God of, you name it,
Yeah,
another comparison.
Marduk or
Marduk.
Baal. Yeah, totally. Yeah, yep. Yeah, it gives the insight that, there was a certain way of conceiving of the world and how it came to be, and deities and temples and divine rule. And I mean, there's a kind of mindset towards these things of which Israel is a part. And obviously there's very distinct claims. I mean, um, insofar as something like Enuma Elish is similar to Israel's account of creation, there are things that set it apart in a radically unique way. I mean, and I think this is where the Sabbath is not a throwaway command. I've heard it said that we can break there's 9 of the 10 commandments we could break in a religious setting, or in a church or in a synagogue, and you'd be in churches, really, not synagogues, but you'd be in trouble for breaking the 9 commandments. Except in our culture, the commandment about the Sabbath, it's almost like we'd be happy if you broke that, because that almost looks like laziness. So it's like
Right.
there's this disconnect about the importance of Sabbath, but I think it's understanding and wrestling with these ideas, because, yeah, you're right. At the very end of the New Testament is the image. And what's interesting is the whole of creation in Genesis, or in Revelation 21 and 22, is portrayed as a city, and it actually goes on to say there's no temple here. And the idea is, if you're reading in as you're following from the Hebrew scriptures, you're like, oh yeah, there's no temple because it's all temple. And it goes on to describe the people who inhabit this newly restored world, and they're described like priests. They're dressed like priests. I mean, so the whole idea of creation is God taking up residence, not somewhere else, but to live among people, that we might worship and serve him. And the whole thing is buzzing with the glory of God. And both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, in their own way, I think, in ways that are really interesting, but probably beyond an hour podcast. But they're trying to draw that out. Look, the creation, God desires to live in it. But here's where it has a practical, and this is where, when you get to the New Testament, you even find it pretty obvious in the prophets. But when you see Jesus and how he thinks about the Sabbath, there is a real issue of justice and love and grace built into the idea of Sabbath. This is really cool. Let's see, in Midrash Tamid, it gives the Levitical prayers for each day of the week. They're psalms, different psalms, right? On the Friday, just before Sabbath, they read Psalm 93, which is what you call, it's like a Yahweh is King psalm, right? Like God is King. And on Saturday, on the Sabbath, they read Psalm 92. And so it's like it's out of order. They put 93 before 92. And Psalm 92 is actually, it's headed with, it's a psalm for the Sabbath, right? But the idea is Psalm 93 really portrays God as king, bringing order to the chaos, bringing cosmos out of chaos, Psalm 92 is a celebration of that very God. But it's this idea that God bringing order out of a non-ordered world is a sign of his victory. So the question becomes, what does the world look like when God is in his temple? When God is running the world from his holy temple, what is the outcome of that? And so Jesus, like he does with all of the teachings, right? Like, for example, the Beatitudes, you shall not kill. He's like, yeah, not killing is great, but travel murder, follow that to its beginning point, and you have hatred and greed. And so Jesus deals with, it's almost like he deepens our understanding of these commands, but he does that uniquely with Sabbath, right? Because he'll be doing things from an onlooker's perspective. You're watching, you say, you're breaking the Sabbath. You're violating the Sabbath because you're supposed to be at rest and repose. He's like, yeah, God's idea of rest is that the blind would get their sight. God's idea of rest is that the oppressed would be set free, that the discouraged would have good news told to them. So there's this deepening of Sabbath, that it's not merely mimicking God, like God was tired after creating, so he needed to take a nap. And so now we'll have a day a week where we take a nap. But the idea is to embody this movement from chaos to cosmos, bringing the order to the world. So from the Christian perspective, to talk about Sabbath as a day is to misunderstand kind of the whole point of the day, because it's almost like this signal of a larger reality wherein the whole world would be swallowed up with the rest of God. So as Christians, we live in this, yes, and there's a big discussion about taking a day off, and I think that's vitally important, and that follows from this discussion. Well, you could take a day off and miss the point of Sabbath, right? Like you could have a day of rest and relaxation, but if you don't grapple with this idea of Sabbath is God taking up rest and us taking up the rest of God, Sabbath becomes a really small issue. So in that sense, to do away with Sabbath is to really miss the point of the kingdom of God, I think. Right? I mean, I could be wrong. but I think that's the case. And so whatever discussion we have about observing a day off, before we do that, we have to grapple with the larger image of the rest of God.
Well, there's a couple of things that you said that are actually, turning my gears a little bit. My audience knows this. They hear me say it all the time, almost with every guest, that trauma is a lack of Sabbath on the inside of a person. So in other words,
that's good.
What trauma does is, even if you observe Sabbath, you won't have the experience of Sabbath. Those are two separate, and you just named that you can observe something but miss the point.
Right.
I think for a lot of people, what trauma does at a profound level is it creates associations that are deep.
Wow.
They're hardwired.
Yeah, right.
And those associations prevent the experience of God's intention for us, peace.
Right.
And now here's the crazy thing, right? So Sabbath is not so individual. So Dr. Holly, you would appreciate Dr. Holly. You know, my Old Testament professor, Harding.
Yeah.
He did my Pentateuch class. He did third semester Hebrew for me. He's been an incredible teacher. Anyway, the Sabbath is one of three. This is getting, hopefully my our listeners don't get too lost or whatever, but the Sabbath is one of three transitional commandments on the Decalogue.
Right. Yes.
So the Sabbath is this intersect between the vertical and the horizontal.
Right.
Well, here's my thing though, that I think is so important about the Sabbath, is that the Sabbath is whenever I'm out of sync with God, or a lack of Sabbath is when I'm out of sync with my neighbor. So I can't say that I'm observing Sabbath if I'm out of sync with either one of. That's a problem.
Right.
Okay, number one.
Yeah.
The other thing, when we fast forward and we look at Paul's theology, I've been studying out Philippians in the Greek, and this idea of irene, or peace, is communal. It's about community, the community witness of relationships. And so this community, if done right with the messianic ethic, that
Right,
the
right.
kingdom is really about, that ethic heals people who've been rejected. That ethic
Yeah.
helps people who've
Yes.
been wounded. That ethic is restorative. And so the ethic of peace is based in Sabbath, but Sabbath is actually based in community versus individuality.
Right,
there's a
right,
there's a
right,
there's a,
right,
like a
right,
both and there. So how am
right.
I doing on my theology? Because
No,
this is
I
stuff I'm
think, no,
really
I love what you're saying about yeah, that there is a relationship to our common, uh, you know, our neighbor. This call to Sabbath isn't merely, and I think it's hard for us to, at least it's hard for me. We think of rest as a means to better and more productive work. And so often the Sabbath gets like, I gotta rest so that I can, 6 days, and then I rest, and then I'll be able to do more on the next 6 days. But Sabbath isn't like that. It's not in the service of our materialism or our work ethic. It's
right.
not, it is about what you're describing. It is about embodying a way of life that is fully directed toward God to such a degree that we lead lives of justice. Might not go far enough. Maybe love is the better word, because it's this like uh, um, Isaiah chapters 56 through 66. Uh, Most, and I think for good reason, see these chapters as dealing with that period when people are coming back out of exile and they're coming back home. Who gets to be in? What's membership look like? We've been away from home for a long time. We've taken new wives. Who gets to be in? And the chapters open with, don't let the foreigner say, I don't belong. And don't let the eunuch say, I'm a dry, withered tree, or whatever. But the foreigner, the eunuch, which were some of the groups excluded from Israel's temple life. Now the prophet is saying, let them come in, but you've got to keep Sabbath. You've got to keep my Sabbaths holy. And there's something about that. I don't think God is just looking, I want to make sure you're very disciplined and you're like my people. But I think nothing more embodies the spirit of what God was seeking in Israel than observing the Sabbath and keeping it holy. Because like the temple, right? The temple isn't an end in itself. And in the Bible, right? The temple is like a sign along the road towards the creation-wide temple. Sabbath is something like that too. Sabbath is almost like a sign along the road towards a world flooded with God's love and justice and righteousness. So for Sabbath to not mean something for the neighbor would be a severe misunderstanding. And we can get really selfish with the Sabbath in our culture. Like I said, I can't tell you how many discussions I hear and books being written. I have like 3 friends writing books on the Sabbath right now, and they're all wonderful. But but in the wrong hands, that thinking can be about me and my rest. And that's part of it, but it's bigger than that. So I think it's a more challenging idea than we make it out to be in that sense.
Well, there's something vocational about
Yeah.
image bearing and being a Sabbath keeper. So for example, when I
Right.
think of, if we think of like it kind of reminds me, like in the Old Testament, this is one of those things too, when I think of like monumental law. So it's this
Mhm.
idea that it's not about the letter of the law as much as it is about the principle.
Right.
And
Right.
I think sometimes we, like, what is the real principle? Well, we see in Hebrews, right, that the Israelites, they kind of missed the rest. Well,
Exactly.
well,
Right.
because of disobedience. And so Sabbath is really about this trust. Again, I'm
Uh-huh.
in sync
Uh-huh.
with God, I'm in sync with my neighbor, and
Yep.
the prevention of experiencing that trust and that rest is now when we don't have Sabbath, we don't have peace, and
Yeah.
we aren't situated, as you mentioned, going back to Genesis 1 and 2, we aren't situated in that created order. And that's where our
Right.
security really
Right.
comes from. And as
Right.
Christians, our
Yes.
security comes from the already, but the not yet. So that's a tension point, right?
Mhm,
But there is
mhm.
a Sabbath that exists for us right now in heaven, but it also exists for us here in the kingdom on
Yeah,
earth. And
there's the
that's a
challenge.
hard, so we're observing, and this is where you get, let me kind of just say this real
Please.
quickly. Torah observant Christians, Seventh-day
Mhm.
Adventists, there's other spinoffs too that have probably been a reaction
Sure.
to the lack
Yeah,
of
sure, right.
observing. Can I just have you very, very briefly talk about how some of these groups have maybe pushed back against or reacted against mainstream evangelicalism?
Yeah, yeah, and again, it's very understandable, and I don't wanna speak out of my depth because I'm not, I don't run in those circles. Uh, but I think anytime uh, again, if you have this, you know, full discussion of the rest of God in Scripture, like you mentioned Hebrews, like and Hebrews is quoting Psalm 95 by saying, the disobedient didn't enter the rest, or the land of Canaan, the rest of God. And so it's like, look, there is rest available for God's people, but it requires you being humble before Him. Um, but it's not turning these things into a law for the church. These are no longer badges or identity markers that we wear in terms of commands being obeyed, any more than circumcision or temple or kashrut or any of the other identity markers for your first century Jew when Jesus shows up on the scene. And so I think, um, again, what's difficult, I think, about Jesus for us is there is I like to think of it almost as like a deepening of what's happening in the Hebrew Bible. It's in concert with everything that's there. Um, but it's like once you begin with Jesus and look back at these texts, it's like you get a new insight into the extent to which God intends um, you not to murder or to observe Sabbath or to not covet. I mean, even to the point, right? Shema, like to love and love the Lord your God. It's not the same in the Shema as obey the Lord your God. I mean, Jesus is, I think, trying to show like God is really after something bigger than your duty. and and anytime I think you turn what God seeks from humanity into duty and imagine that by that duty you are redeemed, it's to reverse the process by which I
Wow.
think salvation comes into our lives, right? Because Israel receives the commandments post deliverance, right? They're not obeying these in order to be saved. And so,
Good
however,
point.
we're going to think of these things, they have to fit with the larger picture of the grace of God through Jesus Christ. So I'm a little leery of legislating Sabbath for Christians, um, but I would want to advocate that we don't do away with Sabbath, because by doing so, we'd be doing away with what you just described, loved for God and neighborliness. It's just that it's much more than just a day off.
What
But
I
the day
really
off
appre
is important too. I take a day off. I try, like where it's just rest. I try to have a Sabbath spirit to my life. But anyway, sorry, I cut you off.
what I really appreciate about what we're doing is we're wanting to elevate people theologically, not just in terms of being pragmatic. I think that sometimes just certain cultures of people who love God and want to keep things simple can really look for practicals. You know, when people are in
Yeah,
survival mode,
right.
they look for practicals. Just tell me what I need to do. Just tell me what's
Yeah,
next. And I'm
right.
like, wow, that's not the point. That's not where
Yeah, it's
we're at.
difficult. It's kind of tough to do. Yeah,
And I think that we just really need to elevate the conversation and people's minds understanding the theology or the way that things work
right.
together is part of that process. Let me move forward here.
Yeah, man, no
In the
doubt.
90s, there were many ministry paradigms that were bent on world evangelism, converting
Uh-huh. Right.
large numbers of people. We had an overly driven evangelistic culture, and it was based
Yeah.
in something good,
Right,
right?
right, right.
Let's save people. You know, by the 1990s, and I've been saying this almost every podcast, by the 1990s, by 1990, Christianity Today had put out that there were over 500 mega plans to evangelize the world by the year 2000.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So, and part of that just had to do with the baby boomer generation. They've kind of been a flex point. They've been a leverage point for building huge command centers in terms of church culture. But
Totally.
yeah, Jesus didn't come back. Okay, we
Right.
saw that. We got that memo. And then now there's just a blast radius of people who remember being driven, being
Mm, mm.
authoritatively even abused.
Yeah.
And you want to talk about going on a sabbatical in the 90s?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
No
Yeah,
way.
sure. Yeah,
That would have been
right, right.
completely, like you had said, people would have looked at it, and said lazy or whatever. I'm just wondering, when you look at the push for church growth and when you look at the theology of Sabbath, how can we help
Yeah.
inform church growth based off of this piece here?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have a ton of thoughts on this. I'm not sure all of them are correct, and I'm not sure which ones of them are an axe I'm trying to grind, and which one of them are, out of love,
Yes,
because
sir.
I appreciate the idea of the stats and keeping stats. I'm sure at one point I was a stat on someone's prayer list, and so I'm grateful that someone would be scrupulous enough to take account of those, whose lives matter. So I get the rationale, and what drives that is, I think, or at least I want to say, is good, thoroughly good. But yeah, there's a cultural thing that happens to the church that I almost feel like we think we're above, or if we're shrewd enough, we can kind of baptize cultural ways into the church and redeem them, but not realizing that they actually work their way into our lives in subtle and destructive ways. And yeah, I know the 90s, it's kind of the height of what has been called the church growth movement. And we tend towards language. For example, at least in the churches I'm connected with, we tend towards language like winning the world for Christ, and all of that is good. But for us in the West, winning is everything. So even that can lead us down a path of hubris that is dangerous before God. And so we don't view the worldwide spread of the gospel as the work of the gospel or even of God himself, but it's us. And so and that usually works itself out in overly careful plans, or maybe an obsession with plans. And so that can deform us without us realizing it. Then when when the curtain is drawn or whatever, when the wool is pulled over off of our eyes, and we notice, wow, we're not that strong. The task of salvation belongs to God in ways we weren't aware. Some people have crises of faith because they were under the impression that we could do it. If we got the right formula, we could do it. If we worked hard enough, we could do it. And so I think there are a lot of people that have had that experience. I know a lot of people that have had that experience, and they're very exhausted and they don't have a lot left to go on. But so I think there's a word that you don't see much. It would be a Latin word, missiology. I don't know if you ever heard that, but it's an latry, like an idolatry, right? Like it'd be the worship of idols is the worship of, idolatry is the worship
Right.
of idols. Missiology would be worship of the mission. And so this is the idea that the mission that God has for the world, we take up, and without realizing it, that becomes God. And so God is kind of like in the service of our mission.
Wow.
Rather than the mission as coming from God and only possible with his grace and help. And so I think even the way we pray, the way we read scripture, the way we preach sermons, it grows out of the way we think, out of our theology, the way we think about God. And when mission is central, now it'd be nice to say the mission and God is central, but even that doesn't go far enough. To not have, the Holy Trinity, like the triune God as the center for the church, and to have something else, even something as noble as mission, as our core, our center, it probably means you will be restless. It probably means you won't have space for
Yikes.
Sabbath, because at the core isn't a trust and desire to honor God, it's achieving the mission. And again, that's subtle. Mission-mindedness and missiology are two ends of the spectrum, but the line between them feels very thin, and we can cross over them without realizing it. So I think Sabbath is an idea, a biblical idea, to ward that off. It's to set God as the center. Sabbath requires, the whole thinking about Sabbath is to set God and worship of God at the center of his people, not some goal.
Well, and I can't remember if it was in Deuteronomy or Exodus that when they were given specific instructions about the Sabbath, for instance, they were to gather a double portion, I believe, the day before Sabbath.
Yeah, exactly.
The preparation, the commitment, the devotion, but then the trust.
Yeah.
In terms of where your provision comes from, because to me, Sabbath isn't just about God ordering the cosmos and the chaos. It's also about who I trust is who my provision is going to come from.
Yeah.
Also,
right.
if I'm doing Sabbath, that means that I can't be so focused on protecting or defending myself.
Dude, for real.
So now we have protection, we have provision, and we have the ordering of reality, right? God has the reality stone. I'm going to go Avengers for a moment. But I mean, he's got the gauntlet, and it's like, yo, he has all of that. That's humbling. But if we want to, we can push back against that and not even know it. That's scary too.
Right. Yeah. So I mentioned before there were at least two directions in which Sabbath comes on the radar. The one is creation oriented, and it's not completely divorced from the other one, which is the Egypt saga, right? Like Israel's time. And this is Deuteronomy in the 10 Commandments and Deuteronomy. It emphasizes not creation, but Egypt. And the rationale for Sabbath there is you were slaves in Egypt. And so, they would understand better than we do the oppression and pressure. And, doesn't seem when you read Exodus chapters 1 and 2 that Pharaoh was in the habit of giving them a holiday or a weekend. I mean, it multiplies the word hard work. Like he made God's people work in the service of the empire. And so here is this new way of life in the desert where you're going to have to not work and learn to be provided for. And I think this is the reference in Jesus's prayer, give us today our daily bread. It's calling this to mind, right? The daily, the portion that God provides. So to observe Sabbath is to call to mind that God's the deliverer and sustainer of us, not Pharaoh, and not even our own charisma or ability. And so, it's a check against the ego of the church to observe Sabbath in that way.
What was that Latin term again?
It's not one you're going to find much. Missiology. But it's just the worship of the mission. There's all kinds, and that's the thing about idolatry, right? Is it's not at least in our culture, we're not bowing down to graven images. Well, we may be, but not like, not many of us have whatever Asherah figurines or something like that. But like, idolatry is a subtle, like, there's, I'm sure you've heard like bibliolatry, like the worship of the Bible, like the Bible itself is God, or ecclesiolatry, the worship of the church, like the church is God.
Wow.
And so all of those are so close to dead center that they sound and feel right until you notice, as Augustine says, like we are restless without the rest of God, right? Like it's what we need at our center is God, and that's harder than we thought. It's way harder than working super hard.
And again, we're gonna pay for not being within the rhythm of created order.
The Sabbath is something that is needed in our society right now and in the church, because it does set God at the center. again, the danger of our newfound enthusiasm for social justice is that we define what justice and things like that, equity and righteousness, look like according to the agendas of the world.
Right.
Sabbath puts on the map a kind of love, right? A life of love, a community of love, that one must be in sync with. And I think that's the idea. Jesus healing and breaking, quote unquote, the Sabbath is a way of saying to those who are saying, you're violating the Sabbath, he's saying, no, actually, this is embodying the very point of it. What's it look like when God takes up rest in his creation? Like this, not like being selfish, right? Like, and so it's such a needed theology, I think, for the church. Yeah, you said something else that had my head spinning, but anyways, yeah, that's good, man.
So what let's look at here leadership perspectives. So I don't think many people will probably push back against sabbaticals now and Sabbath because we are developing a Sabbath culture, and I think it's
Yeah,
healthy. I do
yeah,
think as
yeah.
we do that, we need tons of education
Right,
and help people to know what's going on. Some people might say, well, my minister doesn't, he gets time off, but I don't. Or,
right,
why is it that
right.
we like, is it that they want to go do it because they want to go study or they want a long vacation?
Yeah,
And it's like,
yeah,
no,
yeah,
actually,
right.
you need some more education
Yeah.
on this. When you think about going on a Sabbath or sabbatical, or when you think about ministers who have, as a minister, why would you say that it's vital? And specifically as a
Yeah,
minister?
yeah. Well, what's interesting is the idea of a sabbatical for ministers. We're it's keeping in step in some sense, like you're saying, with creation, but it's also like pretty accepted in our hurried business culture too, right? I mean, like people who work
Without
a
question.
ton in good companies anyways, they give you a break every 5 or 7 years, right? And because any wise manager understands that if I want to get the most out of my people, they need to have some energy, and so they get that. And so there's some of that, even just the logic of that, like from a congregation standpoint, like you want your ministers to have God at the center. It's not just because you collect a paycheck and devote all of your time to the congregational life and all that means. It doesn't mean that you are not also given to the temptation of hurriedness. The last thing I want to do is be led around by someone who is running on their own strength. And just having done ministry for a while, it's exhausting, and some are better than others at it, and I'm still learning. But yeah, I think it's an appropriate thing for the service of the church. And this again is where, if we want to talk about and use language like sabbatical and talk about the Sabbath, I would want to make a differentiation between vacation and Sabbath. Like some people take a Sabbath to write a book. I would almost want to say, yeah, don't write on your Sabbath. Like that's not the idea, is to work more. It's not a break for you to seek out your endeavors. I think the idea is to really rest, replenish, worship, pray, be with family in the ways that allow you to commune with God. That in a hurried life, when you're caring for a group of people, becomes more and more difficult, and we're human. So I think rest is it's us surrendering to the idea that we're not gods, and having been a congregant and not on the other side of the pulpit or whatever, not being a church leader for most of my Christian life, we have outrageous expectations of people that do ministry.
Yes, we do.
And so I don't know if there's a Latin word for worship of the minister. There's got to be, but we can make them into gods and expect too much from them. So I think I took a long break between my last ministry job and coming here, and it was intentional. We broke ties with a lot of chaotic things in our life just to heal and when you're caring for people, you want to be centered. And I want, I want my shepherds to be centered. So I think that's the idea. Yeah, it's like you said, there'll be some who will push back, but it doesn't take long to dismantle that thinking, even biblically, in my mind.
No.
But I get it. In our culture, a sabbatical looks like laziness, but it's hard to rest too. Like, I've talked to ministers that, like they're on sabbatical, they're like, this is hard. I just want to, work. And so it's hard work to just focus and be connected with God, which in my mind, that's numero uno on the job description for my minister. Like, be oriented around God for us, like we need you to be like that. So that's how I defend it. I don't know. It's probably a better way, but I'm all for it.
Well, yeah. And I love the fact that you just mentioned that between your ministry assignments, you intentionally took time between. And I think that, Sabbath isn't just about rest, it's about pace.
Oh,
And about
great.
going to the next thing. And so
Yes.
that was so smart. That feels like a really good way a really good lead in to where you're at now.
It would have blown my world up. And it's funny, like, and ministry, this is where I'm grateful there are men like you around, and you're accessible, and you're doing stuff like this, because for ministers, there's a lot of trauma, man. It's hard. It's hard to not be liked by everybody. It's hard to understand that the role of a minister is not to people please. We're not, diplomats. We're not there to make people happy. That's not we're there to nourish and lead and guide to the glory of God. And sometimes that's no fun for people. But that can drain one. And I remember when we had stepped out of our last ministry role, feeling like, okay, I could, we were going to go right into another ministry job, but I remember thinking like, I got to unwind, because I'm not sure I don't have some access to grind, and I don't want to move into my next congregation with any kind of like ulterior motive, trying to balance the scales because I was wounded, or, and so I think Sabbath is all of that healing, at least for me and my wife, to like, cry with God, and, like, this hurts God and I want to do this about it, but trying to listen for God. And I'd hear something like, yeah, don't do that. Just rest, sit still, trust me. And so without that, I'm convinced I would flame out of my next, I wouldn't, yeah, you're right. I probably wouldn't be here. Probably wouldn't have been hired here, because I would have been too keyed up. So, and that's normal. I think that's normal. I know a lot of ministers that go through that. I'm not unique.
I believe that right now, especially with the last year, I believe 2020, I believe it probably put 5 to 10 more years of wear and tear on ministers than they realize, number one. I also do believe, and I'm not diagnosing any minister, but I believe that there's a ministry paranoia that develops. People become a bit paranoid when they're in the ministry. And I think it just kind of feels like, well, I'm being discerning, or I'm being extra diligent in how I say things. Actually, it's changing your personality.
Yeah. Oh man. I feel like I want to go take you down in my living room so I can lay on the couch and talk with you now. Because you're hitting it, man. I'm surprised you can pick up on that and not be in the full-time ministry, because I wouldn't have been able to articulate that. But absolutely, dude. That is absolutely the case. It's exhausting. It's hard to be, what's the word? What's the key? Ministers are taught, there's a seminary thing, I'm sure you've encountered it, but like self-differentiation within the congregation, right? Like being able to be authentic in the best sense of that word. Wow, it's hard. It's so difficult. But I don't say that and have the expectation, like, congregations, you should understand that. How could people if they're not doing it? That's why I'm surprised you do. And so that's just a cross you have to bear. You don't get to like point back and say like, hey, it's your fault, I need a break, because that's not it at all. It's that ministers are no one's perfect, so yeah, that's good, man.
Well, if it wasn't for, so I have an incredible minister, Tim Sherrill. He had me
Oh yeah,
teach
he's a good guy.
our small group leaders differentiation and leadership. It's like a 4-part
Mm-mm.
series that he had breakdown
Wow.
for my people. And honestly, so this sounds bad, but at times I feel like people probably already know this stuff or whatever because they've been around a long time
Sure.
or they've been in ministry. And more I find out, whether it be trauma or differentiation, that people don't know and they need teaching
Yeah.
on that. And that's okay. I just
Yeah.
assume
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
know.
Yep.
But
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
it differentiation. It's interesting. I've got a blog series. It'll be a 4-part blog series coming out in the next week or so, maybe, on that. And so I'm actually really glad you brought that
That's
up.
great. On my uh what a sabbatical, I guess I never used that language, but that's basically what it was. It was just us resting and pulling back from life. And um it was difficult because I was left when the noise kind of settled down, and I wasn't like running the show and like giving the vision and like showing my gift and using my gift, like all of the things that are me. um and I'm sitting there with God for an extended period of time, like all of the sudden, like it's like the walls come crumbling down. Like I realized, like, oh wow. And it came through someone telling, I have a friend, he's a good friend, so it came from the best possible place. But he said something like, Jason, you're a big intellectual baby. And man,
Oh,
and it was
wow.
public. Oh yeah, it was public
Say
too. We were
what?
like in a group setting. Yeah, he's a
My
good,
brother
like
flexed.
a really good friend. And he said it like, joking. But oh man, it stuck with me. And I'm like, I'm a baby. Like, there's so much in my life I'm just immature, and I don't handle challenges well. I don't,
Mm,
and I'm supposed to be doing that well in ministry, and I'm really bad at it. And that has to change, like, so what do I need to work on if I want to serve God's people? Because if I'm not going to work on those things, if I can't grow in those things, then I better hang up the gloves, like no more leading people around if I'm not going to grow in these areas. So that's a massive, like such a fruitful discovery that I wouldn't have had if I was running at the pace that I was at. And so most of the time ministers come back with a sense of like, oh yeah, there's things I got to change about myself, and that's good for all of us, I think.
let me ask you, to bring it in for a landing. There's a
Yes,
lot of
please.
young teachers like myself, even younger than me, coming up, and the next generation of teachers are incredible, and they're going to include
Yeah.
more females, which I'm really excited
Oh,
about.
yep, totally.
What encouragement and advice do you have for the next generation of teachers?
Oh boy. Um, Nothing that I would say is original. It's stuff that's, being passed on to me. But well, I guess in some things, I guess I am learning. But I think the hardest thing in the setting right now, and in churches like ours, there is such an onslaught of teaching and content and podcasts. I mean, the things that are right at our fingertips. Like when I had to go spend a ton of money and time to learn. Now I could download a podcast and get the same information. There's something to be said for the classroom. But my point is that there is this environment that almost you could become preoccupied with the study part of being a teacher. And I don't think the academy is, like higher learning, biblical studies is always the best role model for teachers in the church. And so I think being very cautious about that. I mean, getting an education is instrumental, and going back to seminary. I mean, this. You've done all this, and it broadens you in ways that the congregation needs, but that gets away from you fast. And so I think just through failing, is cultivating a love and a desire to use all that you learn to take care of God's people. And I know that sounds so basic, but teachers are really tempted to be focused on themselves, because we're full of surprises, right? I mean, at any given moment, we have this content, and we can surprise people like, oh, I didn't know that, and wow, that sheds a new light on that. And so you can come to think that that's your job, to just surprise people with the hidden things in Scripture, but that's not it. It doesn't always help. And so through a lot of my own failing and being humiliated, learning to bring all of your learning in the service, and it might not even be always at a congregational level. It might be your family group, it might be a brother, but I think for me, that's how I'm defining success, like being a teacher, like trying to teach people about God in a way that isn't about me or what I've learned, so that's so basic. I didn't really make any point by saying that, I suppose, but it's where I'm at.
No, it's helpful.
Okay, well, amen. That's
No,
good.
the reason why I say it's helpful is because 4 years ago, I went back to grad school a second time,
Mhm.
and I hit a ceiling. So it was appropriate for me to go back, but it wasn't long before that either A, I was getting myself into, I guess I call it recreational knowledge, where,
Oh, right,
knowledge is
right.
fun. It become, basically I'd have a knowledge binge, and I would just pig out on knowledge, and it's fun. It's
Yeah,
recreational.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
right.
and then I started feeling just dry. Like, I mean, you write papers, you're in the languages all the
Yeah.
time. There
Oh,
comes a
dude.
point where you're just like, either I don't know if I want to do this anymore, or this is, I feel
Yeah.
dry.
I'm no nearer to God after any of this.
No. And then I
Yeah,
didn't want to
I know what
admit
you
that
mean.
certain people maybe were
Yeah,
right about their
yeah,
concerns. But then if you survive that learning curve, if you
for
survive it,
sure.
there is a fruit. Like, the hardest thing for me to hold was this dissonance between theology and trauma. Because on one hand, I would be reading the Hebrew or the Greek, and that would
Yeah,
stretch me like crazy. I remember calling you like when I was in
yeah.
the thick of it. And then on the other hand, I come over in my clinical side, the DSM and all these
Oh, I can't imagine.
specifiers and all
Yeah,
this
that's
crazy stuff with
crazy.
mental health. Holding that was very fracturing.
I don't know how you could. Yeah,
Well,
that's insane.
it's I think there's bad ways to do it, and I think I've done it poorly at times.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
it is hard, and that's I'm convinced that's part of the test. Like how to manage, like what's a metaphor, like wielding the sword of an education, whatever it is, formal or not. I have friends that have no higher education and run circles around academics
yep.
theologically. So I'm not convinced that the classroom has it cornered. But having said that, there is some like learning to wield that sword for the service of people. It's part of how one becomes a good teacher. So that's why I wonder if what I've said is worth saying, because you just have to discover it for yourself. But yeah, dude, totally. I don't know
Well,
how
it's not,
you
but it's not
could.
going to be clean though.
No,
It,
that's
it
true. That's true.
it's not going to be this perfect process, because I don't really look in scripture and see any clean. I mean, that you can say Joseph was clean, but not really. I mean, like, he's like the cleanest Old Testament guy I can think. The point is that it's going to be a process
Yeah.
regardless. And I made mistakes, but I tell you, man, the end product of how God can use a person is, it's
Yeah.
huge. It's
Amen.
amazing.
Amen. And it's
So,
so cool to see there are so many people that I respect, getting their degrees. And there are ministers who don't, fill that teacher role, but they do teach on a regular basis. But and it's a gift, man. It's a gift. Like you mentioned Joel, Joel P. Like he's an example of a dude that's just like bursting with insight for the church, and that's come from hard study over long periods of time. And so
mm,
there's just yeah, there's an advantage. So I'm really grateful for the teachers. And you're right, there are all these people. Like I said, I think we mentioned before, and I got to be one of the youngest teachers in our churches,
yeah.
but now I feel like I'm old, because they're for real. Like there are so many brilliant people younger than me that are really taking the church into new places. So it's exciting, you know.
what upcoming announcements do you want to share with us? Anything special you'd like to?
Oh, not much. Still trying to become an adult. We're yeah, we're doing ministry here in Northwest Tacoma, just south of Seattle area. We love life here. It's small little group. We're trying to shepherd and yeah, just serve the Lord. I personally have been my wife and I weren't able to have our own children, like biological children, and that was a very formative period in our lives. And it created this really just an enthusiasm for the parts of Scripture that pay attention to infertility and barrenness. And so, whether you call it a motif or whatever, it's just to the side of the center in many texts. And so, I've been working on that, or they've been working on me rather, for some time now. So I've been trying to write a manuscript for a book that pays attention to how barrenness appears in Scripture, because it's there, it's all over the place. So I there's no deadline on that. That's just me, dreaming. But yeah, so I guess you could say I'm working on some kind of work with barrenness. Yeah.
Beautiful.
So, yeah.
That's needed, Jason. I got to be honest. The trauma and the grief of that, there's a lot of different ways of losing kids.
Yeah, right, totally.
And not having the opportunity to parent. In fact, I would say, there's some situations I know of that people in the church have hard feelings, but it's not towards anyone. It's just towards almost the idea of other people having a family, and there's a very isolating feeling.
Yeah, their joy, the joy of their life represents the emptiness and pain of your own. It's hard. I remember being, we're just discovering we're probably not going to be able to have our own kids. And no joke, we had like 6 or 7 best friends all pregnant at the same time. And man, it was tough to even be excited for, and they're our best friends. We weren't like, but it just hurts, man. And so, and that experience happens, I know, in more ways than just barrenness. But what's exciting about that is it's so such a part of the way God has worked through these moments, to tell, not just to encourage and lift up individuals, but to, I would say, even pave the way for a thinking about resurrection and God's life-giving ability. There's so much there. So yeah, no, that's true, man.
I appreciate you blessing us at the very end there. Hey, listen, I want to thank you for joining today. This podcast will probably be a little bit longer. I don't care. I'll be on sabbatical videos anyway. Right. Every square inch of today has been profitable.
Oh, good.
And I thank you for everything you've shared. I'm going to share with you what I share with all my guests, is that, brother, we are with you and God is for you, Jason.
Thank you, man. Means more, That's good. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, if you've been with us this entire time, I am so thankful that you have leaned in and listened to the discussion. I hope that it benefited you. Please subscribe, like, share, hit the bell notification so that when new videos come out, you'll be informed of those. And again, I'm getting really close subscriber-wise. I don't know, by the time this airs, I'll probably be at 1,000. But I just want to thank everyone for all of your support. And this month is going to be awesome. And Joel Peed, obviously Jason, and Michael Burns, and all of those guys, as Jason had shared with me earlier, all of those guys are, I think, from Wisconsin. Or
that's the crew, man. That's right. Represent. Yeah, that's right.
So we will see you next time. Thank you.